Ja, herzlich willkommen auch nochmal im Konferenzdienstags seitens der German UPA im Praktika-Track der Mensch und Computer. Mein Name ist Holger Fischer, ich bin aktuell Vizepräsident und zuständig bei uns für das Programm des Praktika-Tracks. Wir hoffen, dass wir euch auch dieses Jahr trotz der ganzen Umstände, die wir hatten, ein spannendes und abwechslungsreiches Programm im Praktika-Track auf die Beine stellen konnten. Und I will switch to English in a while for our keynote, but let me first do some announcement for the further practitioners track in German. Heute Abend ab 19 Uhr findet unser virtuelles German UPA Dinner statt, für alle, die daran Spaß und Interesse haben. Wir treffen uns gemeinsam zu einer Remote-Mahlzeit in Zoom. Es findet ein lockeres Networking und ein Austausch statt. Die Nominierten unserer diesjährigen UX-Challenge werden dort nochmal vorgestellt und auch die aktuelle Abstimmung zur UX-Challenge läuft bereits auf unserem Miro-Board vom Praktika-Track. Also gerne dort nochmal voten an der Stelle. Moderiert wird das Ganze heute Abend von Thomas Jackstedt. So, gleich nach der Keynote haben wir noch weitere spannende Workshops, unsere Arbeitskreise, als auch unser neues Meet a Stranger-Format. Dort habt ihr nochmal die Gelegenheit, neue Leute kennenzulernen in Zoom-Breakouts und auch euch zu vernetzen, was ja im Rahmen der Konferenz sonst doch etwas kürzer kommt dieses Jahr. Morgen Vormittag haben wir dann nochmal zahlreiche Lean-Coffee-Formate mit ganz spezifischen Themen zu einem gemeinsamen Erfahrungsaustausch. Damit dort halt auch wirklich ein Austausch stattfinden kann, sind die ein bisschen begrenzt von der Teilnehmerzahl. Also versucht möglichst pünktlich halt auch dort in den Räumen zu sein. Die 2 Usability-Testessen, die wir morgen im Programm haben, sind leider bereits voll. Wegen der konzeptionellen 1:1 Zuordnung von Testern und Teststationen haben wir halt auch dort nur begrenzte Plätze. Und alle angenommenen Teststationen und Tester, Testerinnen werden heute auch noch per E-Mail informiert. Ja, morgen um 13 Uhr findet dann noch der Start unseres German UPA Mentorings-Programms statt. Astrid Beck vom Arbeitskreis Nachwuchsförderung wird dort das Konzept präsentieren. Anschließend stellen sich die Mentorinnen und Mentoren halt vor und es werden auch erste Fragen diskutiert. Okay, now let's switch to English to introduce our this year's keynote speaker. Nowadays, lots of companies have taken steps to further establish human-centered design within their structures and mindsets, and it's not that mysterious new topic anymore. On the other hand, there are still lots of companies where human-centered design and topics like usability and UX are not present. Sometimes there's only one UX professional within the whole company of around, let's say, 50 to 200 employees. We have seen in the past workshops in the practitioners track of the last days that the topic of UX management, UX maturity, or UX leadership are of great interest in our community. And many professionals have come to the point where they are supposed to manage and lead the topic of UX in the company. So today we invited Andy Butt to speak about this topic at our conference. Andy is a user experience designer and CEO of ClearLeft, a UX agency located in Brighton. And Andy is a best-selling tech author. He curates the UX London, the leading design conferences, and helped to set up the Brighton Digital Festival. Andy is a regular speaker at international conferences like the SXSW, the Awards, and the Next Web. He currently runs an online community of over 1,500 heads, directors, and vice presidents of design, and is a founding member of Adobe's Design Circle. Andy has appeared on both the Wired 100, the Weimar 100 lists, as well as winning Agency of the Year several times running. In private, Andy is never happier than when he's diving some remote tropical atoll, and he's a qualified PADI dive instructor and a retired shark wrangler. So he's a really interesting person, I think. And he first came to prominence in our industry as a designer and web standards enthusiast. He's driven by a desire to improve and professionalize the industry, which is how he came to start the UK's first user experience consultancy, ClearLeft. He never set out to be a design leader, but now finds himself leading a team of 30 people, almost by accidents, like he say. In a quest to understand what makes a great leader and helps his friends in newly minded leadership positions, Andy started the Leading Design Conference and Slack community last year. Over the past 18 months, Andy has interviewed dozens of prominent leaders and listened in 100s of Slack conversations about the art and craft of leadership. In this session, Andy recounts his journey into leadership, shares his success and failures and the important lessons he's learned on his way. The result is a talk packed full of design leadership heuristics suitable for anybody who is a leader, wants to be a leader, or has a leader. So if you have any questions regarding Andy's talk, please use the chat on the right side here in YouTube, and we will discuss them after the talk. So for now, a warm welcome for Andy Butt, and Andy, the stage is yours.
Hello everybody at the Mensch and Computer Conference. My name's Andy, and I'd like to welcome you to my spare room / makeshift office in sunny Brighton in the UK. Now, as a regular visitor to Germany, I'm obviously really disappointed that we can't all be enjoying each other's company in person. However, I think the organisers have done a wonderful job of pivoting to an online event, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them for all the hard work and effort they're putting over the past few months. So, a few years ago, I spotted a trend. A lot of my friends had moved from being senior designers into leading a team, a department, or in some cases even the whole company. They'd finally got the seat at the table they'd long been wanting. But rather than being happy, they were more stressed than I'd ever seen them before. They had hoped that becoming a leader would somehow solve all the problems they'd experienced as an individual contributor, when in fact it just created a whole ton of new problems they've never had to deal with before. I think they'd fallen for this myth of leadership, that all you need is power and authority to make change, and somehow things will just magically get better. However, it turns out that power and authority isn't usually enough. Power may give you the opportunity to influence, but power alone just won't cut it. Instead, you need to develop a whole new set of skills, which I'll be talking about a little later in this presentation. Now, as I talked to my friends over tea and cake, well, I am British after all, a pattern began to emerge. It was as though I was having exactly the same conversation with my friends over and over again, just with different people. It was very Groundhog Day. Most of my friends were lucky. They'd found themselves in companies that really valued design. In fact, they'd been hired to grow their design teams and grow the impact that design could have in their organisations. Now, that sounded great at interview, but it's proving to be really problematic. They were getting inundated by resumes, but few of the people applying had the level of skill they were looking for. Most of the people they were looking at were only kind of 18 months out of a general assembly course and already calling themselves a senior designer. When they did find the right people, they only seemed to stick around for 18 months. Or in fact, if my friends are in Silicon Valley, 9 to 12 months is quite common for people before they leave for their next opportunity. As a result, my friends were spending their whole time recruiting. They'd basically become recruitment managers rather than design leaders. Now, if they were lucky enough to manage to build a good team, they were finding it really difficult to execute. It turns out that doubling their team didn't seem to double their output. In fact, everything seemed to be taking so much longer than it did before. This was especially frustrating for my friends that had come from an agency background, because what they were used to delivering in 6 months, they were now taking 16. Another common problem my friends were facing was this need to manage upwards. It's all very well having a seat at the table, but it was often seen as a bit of a high chair. Marketing had the budget, IT had the power, and the designers were sort of sat in the corner playing with their crayons. Because it turns out that most organisations, managerial focus follows the money. And if you have IT or technology with 100 developers, and you have marketing commanding millions of dollars in ad spend, design can often struggle to get a look in. Now, managing upwards had sort of consumed so much of my friends' time that they weren't putting the time in to really look after their teams. This was probably one of the reasons why my friend's staff turnover was so high. In many cases, this was the first time their company had even had a design leader. Prior to that, the designers would report into marketing or IT or product. As such, none of the managerial infrastructure was in place, and my friends were having to create everything from scratch, often in the evenings and the weekends and the sort of the gaps between when they were actually meant to be doing their proper work. As a result, my friends were feeling stretched and wondering if they'd made some kind of terrible career mistake. Maybe leadership wasn't for them. Maybe they should just go back to being an individual contributor. I'm sure we've all felt sort of similar feelings at some point in our careers, stuck in that sort of valley of despair, this fear that somebody will eventually come along and unmask us, Scooby-Doo style, for the imposter deep down we really think we are. Now, design leadership is a relatively new activity. We've had technologists and marketers on the board for as long as I can remember. However, design representation at senior levels is still a novelty, at least sort of where I'm from. Most organisations are lucky to even have a director level designer, let alone a VP or the mythical chief design officer who sits on the board. So at this point in my talk, I'd normally ask you how many people in the audience are design leaders, because you're really my primary persona. You're the sort of the main people I'm talking about at this talk. But that doesn't mean if you're not a design leader, you can get up and go and make a coffee now, because my secondary persona are people who have bosses. I'm sure most of you in the audience, unless you're freelance or contractor, have somebody that you sort of report into. What I'm going to be doing throughout this talk is showing you the attributes that I think make up a great design leader, or basically any kind of leader in general. If I'm lucky, and more importantly, if you're lucky, you'll notice that your boss has all of the attributes I'm going to share. If you're unlucky, you might want to kind of raise some of the issues that we discussed today, or maybe even point people to the video of this talk. Now, I've been an accidental leader for myself for the past 15 years. I say accidental because I never set out to be a designer or a design leader. My background is in development. I'm actually one of the early pioneers of CSS in the UK. But now I manage a design team of 30 people. With no real training, I just sort of fell into it. And I think you'll find the majority of design leaders out there, hell, the majority of leaders, sort of feel the same way. So I needed to get better at leadership. So about 5 years ago, I started a Slack community. And I invited all the smartest design leaders I know and secretly inspired to be like to join the community so I could learn from them. I also started a new conference called Leading Design. And one of the benefits of running Leading Design was that it gave me the opportunity to spend time each year with sort of 30 or so amazing design leaders from some of the best, well-known tech companies in the industry. And speaking to these people really helped me solidify some of my own views and practices about what makes up a great design leader. And the Slack channel grew from very little to maybe 1,500, 1,600 heads, directors and VPs of design from large companies, all the major companies that you would sort of know and use every day. And so I've also synthesized the conversations that happen on there into sort of my grand unified theory of management. If you happen to be a sort of a senior design leader and you'd like to join the Slack channel, also please do drop me an email and I'll gladly hook you up. So as I said, I never set out to become a design leader. I mean, who dreams of sort of growing up to be a manager? I wanted to be a fireman. I wanted to be like an aircraft pilot. Also, as part of Generation X, my view of management is that was sort of formed by sort of slacker movies like Office Space. To me, managers were the enemy. Until one day I accidentally woke up and found myself, having become one. Some days I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job at leading my team. And other days I feel like I'm the living embodiment of the Peter Principle. The idea that people get promoted to the level of their own incompetence. Now that might sound a bit harsh, but I deliberately designed my own company and my own team to be the least talented person there. Let me explain. When I started Clear Left, I hated the classic model of design leadership. The superstar, black turtleneck wearing sort of designer who surrounds themselves with a bunch of sycophantic juniors in order to fluff their own egos. These are the design gods who wanted to be the one unquestionable source of truth when it came to designing the organisation. And as a result, they would avoid hiring anybody who could maybe question their authority, who might be better than them, or one day become better than them. So it's all very sort of ego-driven madmen stuff. This was the traditional approach to leadership, often depicted by this sort of organisational pyramid. Those high up in the organisation got there by standing on the shoulders of their teams. But because they are higher up, they get to see more visibility of what's going on, but also exert a downward pressure on the shoulders of the people below them, crushing them sometimes. And this was a model that never really attracted me. Instead, I found myself practicing a more supportive approach, which I later learned was called servant leadership. In one of the most curiously titled books out there, Orbiting the Big Giant Hairball, the author talks about creative leadership being like a giant fruit tree. The leaders are the roots and the trunks and the branches of the tree, providing support, providing nutrition, providing stability, while your team are the fruits, which you push up to the sunlight, carrying their weight on your shoulders. For me, this was a much more attractive model of leadership. The idea that you hire people who are better than you and then create the space and environment for them to do great work, ideally the best work of their career. So this is the model I try to adopt. You hire smart people, you provide air cover, you provide ground support. Your job is to clear barriers out of their way and allow them to do amazing work. This just naturally seemed like a more grown-up model, and it prioritised individual learning over the sort of leader's own personal ego. So, I believe that we are working in a talent-led industry, and your primary role as a leader is to find and nurture talent. In short, you need to become a talent scout and you need to focus on your talent pipeline. To do this, you need to signal to the community that you really care about design and you invest in people. And doing things like offering generous conference budgets, supporting people that wish to go out there and start speaking, organising brown bag lunches and visiting lecturers, in-house workshops and other learning opportunities are a great way to demonstrate both to your team and the wider community that you really invest in people. Now, this may sound glib, but the easiest way to hire is basically to build the team that people want to be on. If you're an agency like us, it's quite easy to kind of build an amazingly high-powered team doing really exciting projects and shout about it all over social media. But you can do this as well if you're an internal team. If you're running an internal team, you want to build the team that attracts the best people, that does the best work, where folks have the most fun, and most importantly, have access to the best learning and growth opportunities possible. Now, it's important to realise when hiring that salaries really are just table stakes. The best designers usually aren't motivated by money, or at least money alone. They're motivated by interesting challenges and the opportunity for personal growth. And this creates a really sort of benevolent sort of network effect. If you hire great people early on, they will attract other great people due to the learning opportunities that present them. And this whole spiral just will carry on growing. Now, you've got a great team, they're learning. It's important to create a great environment that supports them. Outside of like COVID-19 and lockdown, people spend more time at work than they do at home. So you need to make sure that it's a comfortable and productive place. We're not talking kind of like beer pong tables and office slides here. The place doesn't have to look like a jungle gym or a frat house, and this is kind of like a theme that a lot of tech companies in Silicon Valley follow. But what you do need to do is you need to have a place that's conducive for work. That means having lots of white space or wall space rather, that your design teams can post up their thinking, plenty of meeting rooms, so you don't have to constantly fighting for space, places to have time to be quiet and do focus work. And you might find that what you need as a design team or technology team is sort of not quite what your HR and facilities manager want and expect. So you might have to fight for the ability to take down pictures and stick up sticky notes, or have dedicated meeting rooms turned into kind of like war rooms, etc. But your job, as I say, as a design leader or as a leader in general, is to create the space where people can do their best work. So it can be tough, but you need to go ahead and do this. You also need to make sure that your teams have the right equipment necessary, whether it's a brand new MacBook, a comfortable chair, or just access to kind of Google Docs and Slack. The number of people I know who like end up having to fight their tech team because of slightly arbitrary IT decisions about what can and cannot go through their firewall is really frustrating. So your job is to make sure that stuff is there, and particularly to make sure that stuff is there when they join. I had a friend who spent 6 weeks in their job without a laptop because the HR team, and actually their team that they joined, didn't know the person had been hired until day one. And it took them that long to kind of get the laptop, get the person set up with an account on their system. And as you can imagine, my friend didn't stay there very long because the lack of thought and the lack of onboarding was kind of symptomatic of a bigger problem at that organization. So onboarding and getting people on and into the team is your first opportunity to really impress and show your team members how much you kind of care and think about them. Now, I think it's important to hire slowly. We kind of often work in a space nowadays where you've got to, if someone leaves, you've got to fill the space. But if you rush, you might make a bad hire. If you hire the wrong person, if you hire someone that's kind of, aggressive or doesn't fit well with a kind of culture, that can have a long-lasting effect on the rest of your team. One bad apple can drive all of your best designers or developers out the door. So you've got to be really careful. You need to hire slowly and you need to avoid brilliant arseholes. Apparently Steve Jobs used to say that it's better to have a hole than an arsehole, which is slightly ironic if you have any sort of knowledge of Steve Jobs' management style, which was legendarily aggressive. So I guess maybe most organisms, in companies, there's only room for one arsehole. Okay, so you've spent the last 3 months and a ton of time and effort hiring an amazing team. Now you're there, how are you going to keep them on your team for longer than 18 months? Well, one of the biggest reasons I see people leaving jobs early is that they were sold an amazing culture of learning collaboration. However, when they get there, it's nothing like they were promised. So your job as a design leader, as a hiring manager, isn't just to kind of create this beautiful picture of nirvana to hire people in under the awareness that when they get here, it's going to be different. You need to not just create a set of fancy values, but you need to genuinely live those values. And I think it's important when you're hiring people, not just to paint this kind of beautiful picture of perfection, but to also be honest about where things are broken. We're grown-ups, we know that everything is not perfect. And so be genuine. In fact, my approach to hiring, weirdly, is to try and put people off rather than to kind of attract people. Because if you try and put people off and be completely honest about what the problems are, the people that do stay really want to work with you, and they're going to know what they're facing rather than kind of walking into this sort of land that is nowhere near like what you told them that it was going to be like. I think it's also important to make sure that your team and your offering has a purpose. This is especially true when hiring millennials and kind of Gen Zs. You need to create a clear mission for your company, for your team, and a clear set of values that people can align with. Now, you also need to make sure that your decisions you make as a leader kind of meet those values. Otherwise, they'll just come across as feeling sort of false. I believe, that people that feel like they're doing something that really is meaningful are much more likely to stay. So it's an important thing to kind of focus on. Now, a great way of retaining and motivating people is to foster an amazing sense of community and collaboration. If people are surrounded by colleagues and friends, people they really care for, they won't want to leave. This is partly because they're part of a family, partly because they're having such a good time and are learning, and partly because they just don't want to let the team down. This means creating a tight social network. Now, one way of doing this is to kind of merge your work life with your social life. And you see this happening a lot in kind of startups in Silicon Valley. You arrange movie nights at the end of the day. You arrange barbecues at the weekend. You have drinks after work. You maybe install like a beer pump in your office, and you have kind of like almost like raging parties every night. Now, this might work if you have a relatively young team where their work and their life are indistinguishable. But I think particularly for Europeans, we are incredibly conscious that the people we work with have lives outside of work. They've got families at home, they've got home lives, and people feel pressured. If your boss is constantly saying, hey, come to this party, stick around for drinks after the end of work, we're doing tequila shots, you might not feel comfortable saying no. So you'll probably go even if you don't want to because your boss is demanding it. So try not to pressure people too much into sort of out of office sort of hours social stuff. In fact, what we try and do at Clear Left is do as much social stuff in office hours as possible. And not every social event has to start and finish with alcohol. That's really important. While alcohol can be fun, some people find it, can be problematic and doesn't make them feel welcome. So make sure you have enough events that don't sort of just focus on alcohol. Now, there's a lot of research that shows that people don't really leave companies. And they don't really leave teams. They leave managers. Or specifically, they leave bad managers. So if you're a boss and you find yourself in a situation where all of a sudden lots of staff are leaving, you might want to ask yourself, how am I contributing to this? And what do I need to do to prevent this from happening in the future? Now, this can be a painful thing to do, but it's an important learning experience. Sadly, too many bosses, when they see people leave, will blame the person that's leaving in order to protect their own ego and their own identity. So it's really important to kind of look at how you are contributing to this situation. Now, one reason people are leaving is because they just get bored or burnt out. If you're constantly sprinting to hit deadlines, it's exhausting. Having no flex in your resource planning is exhausting. Constantly saying yes to every project and then kind of being behind is exhausting. I think one of the reasons people leave teams after 18 months is because they look ahead at what the next 18 months is going to look like, and it looks exactly the same. And they're not seeing variance, they're not seeing opportunity to explore or grow, and so they move on to their next job. And the next job, they've got 18 months of learning about that job, and then they move on again and again. Your team's energy and enthusiasm is your most precious resource, so it has to be managed well. And sometimes this means saying no to projects, saying no to initiatives. This is something I think developers are really, really good at, but designers are really bad at. They just want to be helpful. And so you need to kind of create the space in order to do amazing work. And one way to do this is to schedule time into the calendar to experiment, to innovate. This could be following like Google's sort of old idea of 20% time. It might be running hack days or design sprints or whatever. But make sure that your team have some time to experiment and innovate and play. And also you'll be amazed how valuable these times can then roll back into your core product. Okay, got a great team, you've kept them around, but how do you make sure they're delivering at pace? The best design leaders I know spend a considerable amount of time removing organisational barriers, helping their teams move faster and delivering to a higher standard. A great way of doing this is setting up a design system. So many design teams and tech teams end up just reinventing the wheel all the time. And you'll find that a design team and a tech team might have 15 versions of the same button, 10 versions of the same kind of feedback forms. And this is incredibly wasteful and lossy. So creating a design system where all of these things are componentized and consistent can remove unnecessary inefficiencies and waste from the system, can help your team focus on higher level problems and deliver things faster, and basically get their work out of the browser and out of Sketch and out of your staging environment and into the hands of customers faster. So design systems are one way of doing that. Beyond that, I think any in-house design team that has more than 20 or 30 people should really seriously consider investing in some kind of design ops function. It might be a role, it might be an individual, it might be a whole team that can look at the way that design gets done in your organization and remove redundancy, remove barriers, optimize processes. This is basically operations for your design team. Now, I believe that as leaders, we need to be good role models. And a lot of the time, design leaders or leaders in general think just because I'm the head director or VP, I'm too important to empty the trash or make a round of tea or whatever it is. You're too busy doing the important stuff. The problem is this sets a really, really bad example to follow. So I'm constantly trying to make sure that my team see that nothing is too small for me to be focused on. And if I go and see that the dishwasher hasn't been emptied, I'll empty the dishwasher. If I see the water coolers are empty, I'll refill the water coolers. And by doing this, the rest of my team realise that I'm detail focused and I care about this stuff. And if I care about this stuff, they'll care about it too. Now, I'm sure most of you will be aware of Google's Project Aristotle, where they looked at some of the key indicators for the most highest performing teams across Google. And they came up with a sort of following list of factors to look into. So we've already talked about the importance of people to have meaning in their work and the visibility of the impact they're creating. Good managers are great communicators and create structure and clarity. And obviously, a great manager is there when you need them. They'll get roadblocks out of the way and they're incredibly dependable. But as we probably all know, the key thing that came out of Project Aristotle was a need for psychological safety. If you have teams that are comfortable sharing dissenting voices because they know that they're not going to be shouted down or they're not going to have that held against them, they are incredibly high performing. Conversely, if you're on a team that feels really scared about telling the boss exactly how you feel or why something is going to work or why you disagree, you're going to sort of like check out. And so creating a psychologically safe space is incredibly important. It should be one of your key focuses. Okay, so we've got a great team. They're functioning highly. They're delivering fast. In order to support your team, you need to make sure that they have the necessary resources and structures in place. So this means spending time with other executives around the organization. After all, if your designers are constantly having to fight for resources or justify existence, very little work will get done. So a primary role is going out there and being a supporter and a champion for your design team. Now, this can be done in a dozen different ways. You can organise lunch and learn sessions so the rest of your organisation can learn about the power of design. You can set up a company-wide mailing list so people can subscribe to see what your design team is doing and thinking. I've seen teams that run regular crit sessions for teams that don't have designers, so you can come as a product manager and share your challenges and the designers will sort of help you out. A great way of showcasing the value of design is to get your senior designers running design thinking activities and graphic facilitation activities with your senior stakeholders. All of these things go to show and to sort of surface the value your designers have outside of making interfaces. Now, to be taken seriously in business as a designer, you really need to become fluent in the language of business, and particularly the language of your business. Now, there's a current trend I'm seeing in executives taking design-led MBAs at schools like Stanford and Harvard. And I'm also seeing a lot of my designer friends doing the opposite and going and doing more traditional MBAs, or at the very least doing online courses or reading more business strategy books. So rather than talking to executives in the language of design, you're coming to them talking their language. One of the challenges I see designers have is they're so passionate and they believe so strongly in the power of design that they get really frustrated when other executives don't immediately see what they're trying to do or why, or don't agree with them immediately. As a result, it's easy for designers to get drawn into these opinion battles that they can't win, and they leave feeling beaten and deflated, thinking that the organisation just doesn't get design. Now, as the old saying goes, you trap more flies with honey and vinegar. So really good designers are able to build collaborative relationships, forge alliances, communicate the value of design to their stakeholders, and help others meet their own individual goals through the power of design. So the best designers and the best design leaders are communicators. They are active participants in the success of the business, and they use design in order to help others meet and achieve their business goals. Now, one of the best ways, I think, of operationalizing design, apart from building up a design ops team, is to really start to weave design into the governance layer of your organization. Design and design process have become how your company delivers their products and services. Now, GDS, I think, are the organization that sort of really set the standard for this. So GDS, Government Digital Services, they're the people that build all the digital infrastructure for the UK government. And they created something called the Digital Services Manual, which has sort of really become like organisational law. Back in the day, each sort of department or minister, if they wanted to kind of kick off a project, would do it in their own way. And they would effectively, because they had all the power, they would tell other people what to do and how to do it. Then the service manual came in to play. And the service manual creates a set of standards of how you commission a project, how you research it, how you judge its value. And so now everyone is following along this similar path. It doesn't matter how powerful you are, you can't kind of go outside of this sort of service manual and kind of like get your own way and be a bit of a dictator. So having design and technology processes baked into the governance level of your company is amazingly powerful. Okay. Now, first of all, before I go to the next slide, I need to apologise for the language I'm going to use, but I'm British, so I hope it will come across as charming. But effectively, there are two sorts of managers in the world. There are those that protect their team from the shit coming down from above, and there are those that pass the shit directly onto the rest of their team. Now, as we all can understand, the best leaders are the ones that protect their team and shield them from all the crap that's going on in the rest of the organisation, to keep them in a little bubble so they can just focus on doing the best work they possibly can. These are the kind of leaders that their team know will go to bat for you, when the chips are down, and will fall on your sword to make sure that the team are looked after. Unfortunately, this is also one of the reasons why many leaders feel like their role can be isolating, because they're constantly fighting to get resources with a whole bunch of other sort of executives that don't understand them, and can be in a sort of a bit of an isolated position. So I'm a really big advocate of like design leaders and leaders in general getting external support from like a coach or a mentor. Okay, so everything's kind of running smoothly. You're managing up, you've got all the resources you need. You need to make sure that you're also looking after your team on a day-to-day basis. A lot of very career-focused managers spend their whole time managing upwards, or maybe kind of like kissing butt upwards, giving their bosses a sense that everything is going super well in the hopes of chasing the next promotion. But unfortunately, when they do this, they're spending so much time managing upwards to keep their executives happy, they end up not spending time with their designers and end up with a disgruntled or demoralised team. So the answer is simple. Don't spend your whole time managing upwards. Now, this could be really difficult if you have a fairly flat structure. If there's just a whole bunch of designers or practitioners and you as a manager, you're constantly going to be pulled into these kind of conversations. It's also going to be really difficult if you have any more than like 4 or 6 direct reports. The general advice is like 6, maybe 8 direct reports is all you can handle. And so if you have more than 6 people reporting to you or 8 people reporting to you, you need to put in another layer of support. Now, this is one of the reasons why having a VP of design supported by a bunch of design directors is really powerful. But if you're the only design leader in the organization, you might need to have a series of senior practitioners kind of like supporting you on your journey. Because if you're managing up the whole time, you're probably not sharing all of your wonderful craft skills with your designers. So having a bunch of senior practitioners acting as mentors and coaches, I think is really, really important. In fact, a lot of people argue that these design leads, these sort of senior practitioners, are really like the linchpin role in any successful design organization. Now, being a design leader or any kind of leader is tough. And it's hard managing people that really, really care. And designers and technologists really, really care. They want everything to be perfect, and they can sort of moan and kind of gripe a little bit if things aren't, amazing. And so you've got to be quite resilient as a leader. I believe good leaders take a real interest in their team and know what's going on in their lives. And I think one of the best way of doing this is to have regular one-on-ones with your team. Now, this is basic kind of stuff, really, but you'll be amazed how infrequently design leaders actually have regular one-on-ones, especially when folks get busy. I think one-on-ones should happen weekly, maybe twice weekly at tops. But I know people who are design leaders who, or who are designers even, who, maybe only see their manager once every sort of 3 or 4 weeks. And even then it might be in passing. I see a lot of design leaders that are constantly kind of cancelling one-on-one meetings as well. And while I understand why that happens, like you're putting out a fire over here, you're really busy in this meeting over there, a meeting runs over, etc., this sends a really bad signal to the people that you're meant to be meeting with about how much you value them as individuals and you value your time. So you need to have regular one-on-one meetings, and you need to make sure that you're investing in them and you're doing them well. Now, in these sessions, it's really tempting to use them as kind of directional sessions where you spend 80% of your time telling the person who reports to you what they should be doing, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. And I think as leaders, we need to switch that around. Actually, we should be seeing one-on-one sessions as more like a form of design research, where we're listening 70 or 80% of the time and only speaking for maybe 20 or 30% of it. Now, as I said, it's sometimes common that you might only see your boss, in structured meetings or one-on-one sessions, and the rest of the time they're off doing who knows what. And again, that can be really, really stressful if you're busy working away and you don't know what your boss is doing, you don't know how they're contributing to the wider kind of effort of the company. So I think it's really important for design leaders and leaders in general to be visible and take time to, in the kind of like the studio world, which we're hopefully going back to, walk around the studio, hang out in the coffee area, eat lunch with people, be available and generally chat. In the online world at the moment, have set up meetings with people that maybe aren't one-on-one reports, or kind of like things that mimic the sort of the social kind of water cooler moments. So you can just kind of like check in with people and kind of get a pulse of the company. You kind of want to be out there being a bit of an early sort of warning system, an early radar system, picking up things before they get to, a formal meeting. And I know you're busy, but it's very easy to get divorced from your team unless you do this. I think feedback is really important. Your team are not going to grow unless they get feedback. But this feedback needs to be actionable. It needs to be said with kindness. I find there's something really attractive into Kim Scott's book and the idea behind her book, Radical Candor. This idea that like radical candor comes from somebody caring really deeply about the individual you're talking to, but also being willing to challenge them sort of directly. There's almost something kind of quite Californian in this idea of radical candor. Now, being British, I often find myself falling into a trap where I'm kind of far too polite. So I think I've had a candid conversation when, in fact, people have left the meeting thinking everything is just fine and everything's going well. So I need to do a much better job, I think, of like challenging people directly while demonstrating that I care about them. Also, I think which is quite common is if you don't do this, you think you've had a radical sort of, conversation, the rest of your team don't, this builds up and it kind of explodes into kind of like obnoxious aggression, kind of passive aggressive behavior. This is another kind of British trait. If you ever spent any time on the underground, people are incredibly polite, but if you walk slightly too slow for everybody else, they get really, really annoyed and aggressive with you. So there's kind of this bubbling anxiety sort of, bubbling under in British culture quite a lot. And so this is something I need to spend a lot more time practicing, this idea of caring personally but challenging directly. It's also important to praise your team. Don't forget to praise your team for a job well done. Regular praise can be a hugely motivating kind of factor. If people feel that their work is being valued, is being recognised, they're much more likely to enjoy what they're doing and sticking around. It's easy to forget this and assume that people know that they're appreciated and you don't have to say it, but you do, and you need to say it regularly. And actually, I think you need to kind of like do this much more than is necessary. I think quite often we're very good at spotting problems and we give like negative feedback 70% of the time and only positive feedback about 30% of the time. But that can be really challenging because then your boss is only giving you negative stuff. So I think we need to work hard to switch that around, to be constantly saying positive things. So when you say the negative thing that 30% of the time, it really lands and it's really listened to. I think it's also important to make sure that you critique privately and praise publicly. I've seen so many companies where they do like these sort of stand-ups, or they do these kind of crit sessions where basically like they rip people's work and they rip individuals to threads, and that can be really, really challenging, and it definitely doesn't sort of contribute to having a great kind of friendly culture. And so make sure that you praise publicly and criticize privately. We talked earlier about how it's important for people to get a sense of growth and progression. And one way to do this is to have some kind of leveling system or progression framework. Quite often when design teams are new, they don't have something in place, but I bet you your IT team, your tech team, your marketing team do. So if you don't have one, go out and borrow theirs. And if they don't have one, go and create one of your own. This is something we've done recently at Clear Left, and I wish we'd done it years ago. And progression frameworks are super useful, super simple. Basically, you generally have a set of levels. Maybe they're named as to how you kind of call people at different levels in your company. And there'll be a set of behaviors or expected behaviors. Some of these are optional, some of these are required. And what this does is if you have a team member that is looking for a raise or wants to progress to the next level in their career, rather than this just being random or based around kind of the amount of time people have been in the company, you can kind of look down at the set of attributes with them and say, well, look, you want to move from lead to principal. In order to move from lead to principal, I need you to be demonstrating these sets of behaviors. When we next have our meeting, come back to me and show me the behaviors you've been doing. And if this is consistent, then we'll look at moving you to that next level. So those are the 5 key concerns I see repeating themselves time and time again with speaking with new and experienced leaders alike. Finding talent, retaining talent, executing at pace, managing up and managing down. I've tried to share some of my own personal experiences, but I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all approach to creative leadership. Instead, it's a mixture of common wisdom and tactics. A lot of what I said may sound bleeding obvious, but that's hopefully because it's true. However, it's amazing how few people are doing even some of the basic stuff, are actually delivering on the sound bites. You see, while I believe good design leadership is easy to understand, I think it's really, really hard to execute well. So please take on this board the advice I've given today and go out and be an amazing, inspiring leader to your teams. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, and thanks a lot, Andy Butt, for being with us, for having this great talk. I've watched the chat next to our YouTube video, and there are lots of thumbs up, applause, smiling people, and I think it was really great. So we are cheering online. Thank you for your talk. This is what I've learned.
Thank you.
And welcome here to our questions and answers after your talk. So at the moment, we don't have any questions in the chat. So everybody out there, please feel free to ask your questions. We are watching the chat. So for the moment, Andy, would you like to be spontaneous and adding things?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you so much. I've said it already, but thank you so much for inviting me to your event. I mean, it's really impressive. And again, a big round of applause to all the organizers for pulling, moving from an offline to an online conference so quickly. So you've done a brilliant job. One of the reasons that I'm incredibly passionate about design and design leadership is because, as I said in my talk, I think it's a relatively new practice. So many of my friends are coming into leadership roles where they're the first design leader of their kind. And that means that it's incredibly stressful, and they're having to build everything from scratch while being a great manager and while delivering amazing experiences. And because of that challenge, I think a lot of design leaders are feeling overwhelmed, they're dropping balls, they're feeling stressed. So I think the first thing is, if you are moving into a leadership role or you are thinking about moving into a leadership role, it's important to practice self-care. Because so many people, after a couple of years, get burnt out and they beat themselves up because they want to be the most perfect manager. But being a manager is a skill, and it takes time, and you can't expect to switch overnight from being a great practitioner to be a great manager. In fact, what ends up happening is you end up being given a job you suck out, as in being a manager, because you've been great at a job you're really good at. And so that can be quite challenging, and it can be quite a kind of an ego kind of knocking experience, quite humbling experience. So I think most people, when they become a manager for the first time, whether it's design or technology, it doesn't really matter. There's a steep learning curve. You'll feel like an idiot. You'll feel like an imposter. And you might have to wait for your second or third job before you really get into the swing of things. I think it can be quite isolating as well. As I sort of said in my talk, like you jump into management out of a desire to fix all the things that you've seen are broken, but actually you just inherit a whole bunch of more broken things. And if you're the only person of your type in your organization, if you're the only design leader, you can feel really isolated. You've got nobody to talk to who has done it before inside your organization. You can feel out of place. The people who are reporting to you maybe don't think you're doing as good a job as you want to do. Also, the people that you're reporting to feel that you're maybe letting things sort of fall through the gaps. So it can be challenging. So I think for new design leaders or people that are wanting to become a leader, or even experienced leaders, finding a community is really important. That's one of the reasons why we set up the Leading Design community, but there are others. If you're a technical leader, the RANs in Repose Slack community is amazing. It's huge, and there's loads of technical leaders on there, front-end development, engineering, et cetera. Find your people, find your tribe. And you will find that all the things that you're experiencing that you think maybe are unique to you are the same things that people who have been running design and engineering teams for 10 years have also felt and currently feel. And there's something really great about feeling like you're failing and then talking to people who have written books and who are running design at a high level at places like Facebook and realizing that they are feeling exactly the same thing. And that's one of the reasons why we set up our Leading Design conference, to create a community so people didn't feel isolated. I think as well as that, executive coaching is really important. And a lot of executives in your company probably get coaches, your MD, maybe your CFO, your CTO. I think it's important for new managers, if you don't have a support structure in your company, to get external support. And there are some wonderful coaches out there that are offering coaching and training, and they're amazing books. People like Julie Zhu from Facebook has written an amazing book on her management journey. There's an amazing book from A Book Apart on a technical engineering leadership out there. So go and be as well read as you possibly can and get that support, because then you'll know that all the things you're facing and are feeling are things that other people experience. I think the other thing, and then I'll kind of open it up to questions if we've got any, is
yes,
a big challenge I think particularly design leaders have when they move from practitioner to leader is they don't want to leave the design behind. And so you get these people that I call player coaches that are part designer and part manager. And what ends up happening is they become a bottleneck because they're trying to spread themselves too thin. And so they can't keep up with the design work that needs to be done. So the quality starts fading. They can't keep up with all of the 5 aspects of leadership I talked about in my talk. So they're failing. And then they kind of like suddenly go, well, maybe I should have just, go backwards and just be a design practitioner. And to be honest, there's nothing wrong with that. I've got some really good friends in big tech companies who tried leadership for a while or tried management for a while, didn't like it, and went back into a practitioner role. And particularly in Californian and North American companies, a lot of those companies will have separate tracks for what they call individual contributors and management tracks. And unlike in Europe, where a lot of people feel that in order to progress their career, and in order to increase their salary, they have to go into management, increasingly, you can still earn the same amount of money and still have the same status being a very, very senior practitioner. So it's not always the case that you have to be forced into management. But I think if you do become a manager, one of the things that first starts dropping is your ability to coach your team. And I kind of talked about it a little bit in the talk. A lot of people will come and join your team because you're a great designer and they want to learn how to get better at design. But then you're so focused on your management job that you let your craft skills and coaching go to pot. And then your people you're reporting to, after 6 or 9 months, realizing that they haven't learned anything for you in the whole time. And so this is one of the reasons why I believe that the most crucial role in any design team, actually probably isn't the design leader. It's the lead designer. And often a team might have 2 or 3 lead designers. And these are the very, very senior practitioners. These are the individual contributors. These are the people that have the craft skills that everybody else in the team wants to learn from. And too quickly, those leads are turned into managers, and that creates an information vacuum. And I think it's important for tech companies to nurture those leads as long as possible, and not try and escalate too quickly into leadership, because then what happens is you have a whole bunch of people that have lost their creative kind of trendsetters, and they get bored and they leave. And so it's something that Peter Merholtz talks about quite eloquently, about the fact that the design lead is the most important pivotal role in the design team. And so I think that's really, really true. So, make sure that you have those roles if you're moving into leadership to kind of support you and have your back. And then I guess lastly, if you're running a small team of 4 or 5 people, it's easy to support the amount of work that comes in. If you're looking after a team of 10 or 20 people, you can't do one-on-ones with everybody. So you need to have those leads to take over some of that kind of like mentoring and coaching. And also you probably then start to think about kind of moving into getting a design ops role to help look at supporting all the administrative work that you're doing, to make sure that you're finding talent in the right way and you're onboarding that talent, like all the admin and operation stuff. And so I think the perfect kind of like leadership team is a head of design supported by a design ops person and 2 or 3 very, very senior individual contributors. And with that model, I think you can go really, really far.
Okay, thank you, Andy. We've got our first questions, and the first one is from Christian. Do we have any ideas, tips, how to be a design leader for decentralized design teams all over the world?
I mean, I think everyone is in a weird sort of slightly decentralized space at the moment. I think it's tough. I think it's really tough. I have not worked in a highly decentralized environment, but a lot of my friends at work in companies like InVision have, because they're completely decentralized. And also WordPress have a very, very decentralized leadership team. I think it depends on what level of leader you are. Like if you are a director or a VP, effectively, you will be having heads and managers reporting to you. And those heads and managers will probably be representing different geographical regions or different product teams. And so as a head or VP, head director or VP, what you're really doing is you're managing 5 or 6 people in different geographic regions. And as long as you're kind of looking after them, looking after their career progression, making sure that the barriers are removed from their day-to-day work, then I think it is quite possible to do. I think with a lot of these decentralized organizations, you do need to find time to meet in the real world. So InVision and WordPress will have like big global get-togethers, and we'll have big design team get-togethers where everyone flies in, and it's a way of building up personal relationships. Because I think when you're talking and communicating purely through text and through video, a lot of the nuance of communication gets lost. And if you don't know a person deeply, it's really easy to misattribute subtle kind of like turns of phrase. And you might think that you're being, treated in one way when you're being treated, the intention is in another. And so building up a strong physical relationship means that when you go back to working remotely or distributed, you have a good connection. There is a technique which a lot of engineering companies use, which I have reservations about, but a lot of engineering companies and a lot of engineering managers have taken to creating what they call like a readme.txt file for their management style. And what they do is they'll kind of like write a big document that they make available to their team that says, hey, look, this is how I work. I'm a bit grumpy in the morning before I've had my coffee. So, best not, if we have an 8 a.m. meeting and I'm a bit curt, it's not because I'm an arsehole or because I don't like you. It's because I haven't had my coffee. I'm most inspired when I'm working at 5 o'clock in the evening. These are the things that I worry about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And particularly for distributed teams, if you haven't learned that about the individual through repeated face-to-face interaction, having a document you can go to and just go, look, Andy was a bit off today. What was that about? And you go to the document, you read it, you go, oh, it's probably because I caught him pre-coffee. That might help solve some of those challenges. However, the problem I have with manager README files is it can also be used in almost like a passive aggressive way to make the other person have to deal with your foibles. So the last thing I want is for a whole bunch of managers to have README files to say, well, look, I'm an arsehole at 9 or 10 in the morning, just deal with it. And then everyone else that reports to you is like, oh, I better not talk to Andy at 9. By the way, I don't drink coffee and I'm not an arsehole in the morning. I should clarify that. But so what you don't want to do is you don't want to have these documents turn into sort of passive aggressive excuses for poor behavior. So like anything, I think they can be used well and they can be used poorly, but that's one way of managing long-term sort of distance relationships. Another way is just making sure that you do things together as a group that aren't work related. And whether that's like, you know, having a regular design jam, whether it's kind of like having regular socials. If your team does a lot of Slack work, there are tools like Donut, I believe, which can kind of like take people from around the organization and pair you up into little small coffee meetings. And meeting people socially in a non-work environment can be really powerful. One of the things, again, like I've always worked in co-located teams. One of the things I like is this idea of, they call it management by walking about. Often, the point at which someone contacts you with a problem, it might already be too late to solve because they've been scared, they've been nervous, they've not wanted to reach out, they wanted to solve it themselves. By the time it gets to you and it becomes official, it might be too late. One of the great things around management by walking around is effectively, if you've got a studio, you just walk up and you hang out into the coffee area, you walk around and you chat to people. And in these informal situations, it's much more likely that people will go, oh, by the way, Andy, I'm doing this thing, I need your help. Or, you know, have you thought about this or whatever? Or you can just kind of like earwig on conversations and get a sense of whether people are happy or not. That's really tough to do online. So trying to, as a manager, trying to find serendipitous opportunities for interaction that are outside a regular one-on-one. And obviously, whether we're remote and distributed or co-located, having a regular one-on-one, like weekly one-on-ones with your team, hugely important. And so, like, in a way, I would argue that whether you're distributed and remote or co-located, you know, like, in both situations, you need to have good management hygiene. I think if you are co-located and your management hygiene slips, you can kind of get away with a lot more. But I think, so I don't think there's anything extra you need to do being remote and distributed. But I think the problems that exist from having bad management practices are exacerbated. I think there's another thing which I've seen, which again, like this is speaking from friends of mine, which I don't have an answer to, but I think it's a really common thing, which is in situations where you're distributed, but there is a hub of power. You know, so I've got a lot of friends that work for Californian tech companies, but they might be in Finland, or they might be in Singapore, or they might be in London, but they're satellite offices. So all the important decisions get made centrally, and then they get distributed around, and like the team in San Francisco gets to do all the fun stuff, and then the London team gets to, you know, just pick up the pieces. And that can be really frustrating. And a lot of it comes around from the ability for the boss to see what's going on. And so if you have a team where you're catching up because you're on the same time zone all the time and you're friends and you go for coffee with them, you know, at lunchtime because you're all based in San Francisco, you're probably going to think those people are better at their job and give them more responsibility just because of the mere exposure effect, which is a cognitive bias. And if you don't see or speak to the people in London because you've only got a 1 hour overlap, and so whenever you're talking to them, it's very tactical and it's very specific about the work, you might just, you know, out of sight, out of mind. You might not value them. You might not look after them properly. And so a lot of people that are remote and out of the time zone of their boss feel sometimes like they've been left adrift. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you have that setup, you need to put extra special care and attention into the team that are remote and on a different time zone, and you need to kind of give them extra love and extra care. It's the same as when you're on a Zoom call. Like, weirdly, because so much communication is non-verbal, when you're giving a Zoom call, you probably need to be 20% better than you normally would be. You need to be performing. And I think the same is true when you're leading remote teams who are quite far away. You need to put extra effort in to kind of look after them. And you need to take their concerns seriously. And if people are feeling low energy, or you're not getting the performance that you want from that person, it's very easy to blame that person. But I would actually say to managers that are leading people remotely, before you start blaming the person in London or Singapore who's off your timeline as being poor and non-responsive, think about what you're doing to exacerbate that situation and how a lack of regular communication might be making their job really hard. And as a good leader, before you start pointing fingers and blame, you need to figure out what you're doing that exacerbates that problem.
All right, our next question is from Dominic. He said, I understand that I should protect a team from bad influences, but how can I help the organization to get better? My team can then help less, or do I misunderstood?
Again, a really interesting point. So I think that there's a couple of things going on. So I think as a design leader, you have a whole bunch of designers or engineers, if you're an engineering leader, who work best with focus time and work best if they have all the necessary resources. And so your job, I think, is to allow the team to have as much focus on solving the problems they've been tasked to focus as they can. If your team are constantly having to rush around because don't have the right resources, they're 2 or 3 head count down, they're getting into constant arguments with the PMs or the engineering leads over strategy or decisions, if they're unable in the physical space to get the office space they need or the equipment they need, then you might find that they're spending 30 or 40% of their time just trying to clear these barriers, and that's not effective. So when I talk about providing air cover, I'm really talking about the design leader helping your team clear those barriers for them, so they're not having to all clear them individually. That does not mean that you and your team should not try and have an effect on changing the organizational culture. I think we are all living in companies that are suboptimal, and our jobs as leaders and practitioners is to try and get our work done while slowly incrementing and improving the places we work. One thing I find about designers particularly is we get really upset if people do not immediately agree with our position and immediately change the whole culture of a company because we said that we watched a Jake Knapp podcast about design sprints and we should all be doing design sprints, for instance, or we need to be trebling our research team, or whatever the argument is. And we can get very, very insular. We can have a big argument. We can throw our toys out of the pram, and then we can actually create these little siloed bubbles. And so I think there is a thin line between protecting your team from their focus and their enthusiasm versus retreating into a little bubble. And this is definitely not what I'm suggesting. As a design leader, you need to be managing upwards. You need to be showcasing all the great work and all the skills that your team have to the whole of the organization, and lead the change, not by arguing, but by doing. Lead the change through activity. Because while arguing is fun and exciting and it makes you feel like you're right, very rarely do people's ideas change through a well-crafted argument. What generally changes people's ideas is through a well-executed piece of work that proves that the thing you were saying was correct. The other thing I think is that the most efficient design leaders have to be very political, and being political isn't fun. Like, as designers, we never got into design by wanting to play politics, but to be an effective design leader, You need to build a network, a coalition of the willing. You need to find the people amongst your organization that really care about design. And that might be building like links with the head of marketing, or building a really great relationship with the head of technology or the head of sales, and letting them realize that they can progress by using you. You know, if you can go to the head of marketing and let them realize that they can impress a CEO if they use your skills to make that better, more professional looking deck, or they go out and do some research to prove their business case, or you work together to throw up a quick MVP. And so you win hearts and minds by making others look good. And so I think your other role as a design leader, as well as protecting your team's energy and enthusiasm, is to be making other people look good and kick ass. At the same time, I think a really common theme I'm seeing over and over again from a lot of design leaders is a realization that in order to be effective, they need to learn the language of business. So a lot of design leaders I'm talking to at the moment are considering or have done MBAs, or are considering doing courses. There are lots of courses out there that are aimed at designers to kind of learn the language of business and learn the ability to influence. And so you can't do one without the other. You know, you can't just throw a protective shield around your team and leave it because you'll turn into a bubble. You need to, at the same time, be a multiplier of your team's amazing work. And as I said, you know, you need to know when to say no. You need to know which battles are worth fighting, which battles aren't worth fighting. You know, fight the battles that are that are winnable, or that demonstrate to your team that you'll go to bat with them. And I think the last thing, which is weird, and I think it's one of the reasons why I run an agency, and as an agency, sometimes it's much easier for us to affect internal change than an internal team. Because as an agency, we come in and we're not afraid of being fired. At the end of the year, we're not going to have our budgets changed or our salaries affected, or our headcount changed because of something we do in a meeting. And to be honest, we're a very successful agency and we have clients lining up to work with us. And so if a client isn't getting value from what we're doing, if we're not able to affect that change and the client doesn't want us to work with them anymore, we are happy to go elsewhere. For a lot of people, this is their one job, and their mortgage and their family's kind of health and well-being relies on it. And so internal leaders tend to be a little bit less willing to put themselves out there, less willing to put their necks on the line. And I guess that's sort of the sentiment that I was trying to explain with the kind of like being a shit umbrella and stuff. Is like, you need to be willing to put yourself out there, to allow your team to realize that you will be the first one over the wall, over the trenches, and you will be willing, in order to do the right thing, to lose your job. And that's challenging, and that's really tough, which is why quite often, like, we'll have people hire Clear Left in because they know that this is what they need to do, but they understandably want a bit of a protective shield. And so they get an agency to come in and deliver the bad news for them, which, you know, is not super efficient, but it is incredibly effective. And so working with external partners, I think, can also be a really good way of managing that change process. I mean, it's crazy. Like, you know, when we work with change programs with our clients, like, almost certainly, once we start working with the team, the designers, the engineers, the mid-level leaders, they know what needs to be changed, but they haven't been able to, for whatever reason, put that forward in a convincing way. One of the great things that agencies have at their power is we sell all the time. And so we can work with your internal leaders and your teams to understand what the problem is, translate it in a way that the executives understand, but also be responsible if things fail, that we can sort of take the hit. And that means that you can retain your status in the organization, and you can say, well, look, actually we hired the wrong people, rather than saying, oh, we had the wrong idea. So that gives a certain level of plausible deniability, which is why I think partnering with agencies can be really, really effective.
All right, our next question is from Boydell T. As a leader, your voice has more impact and people might not question your input. In meetings and brainstormings, how do you keep an equal and collaborative setup?
Again, you know, brilliant questions here. I think this is one of the weird things. Like I work with a lot of boards. I work with a lot of CEOs, CMOs, CTOs, and they often don't realize the amount of power they have and how a throwaway comment in a meeting might accidentally get turned into company strategy without them realizing that. They might just say, oh, I don't like this, or we should never do that, or whatever. And it was not thought through. It wasn't policy. But then everyone around says, oh, you know, the boss doesn't like this, boss doesn't like that. We better not do this, do that. And often, like, these people aren't aware of the impact they have. And, you know, again, as an external person, then going and saying to the CMO, well, you know, the reason your team aren't doing this is because I don't think you like this. And they're like, oh, crikey, I never realized this, you know. So what you say has an outsized impact. So you do need to be quite careful with what you say. I think it's a challenge. I mean, you know, I think a lot of leaders find themselves day to day in a position where people are constantly asking for their opinion, and their job is to give opinions. And so quite often they then get into the habit of giving opinions when those opinions haven't been requested or not wanted. A lot of the time, I think designers will blame the executives for this behavior, which is weird because as designers, we're meant to be empathetic. So I think one of the things that we should do is use our empathy and our understanding of humans, not just to applying it to our clients and our customers and our users, but also to our internal stakeholders, executive managers, et cetera, And one way of doing this, I think, is by not creating a vacuum in these kind of conversations. I sit in a lot of workshops and a lot of sessions where designers will present their work. But because they're not giving the leadership team any guidance about what kind of feedback they're wanting, the leaders will just go off in a whole bunch of random tangents, which will often be destructive. And this is a common thing, you know, you'll show a bunch of design work, and the thing that catches the leadership's eye is a color or a typeface or a, you know, a particular detail, which is not really important, not super important, but which gets obsessed over. And then the designers will go away and go, well, that was terrible, like, you know, and they will blame the executives. But a lot of the reason is because you haven't at the start of the session said, well, actually, look, you know, what we're doing now is we're presenting our, you know, a final outcome. This is not, you know, this is not up for discussion. This is what we've been doing. Explain how you've got to this point. Talk about the business strategy and the decisions that were made that got you to this point. And then you steer the conversation towards a business conversation rather than aesthetics conversation or an opinion conversation. Also, you know, if you don't want feedback, say at the start you don't want feedback. Just say, look, this is a FYI. You know, we're not wanting feedback. We're not looking for changes. The team are really happy with the thing we're presenting. This is an update. Or if you do want feedback, talk about how you want that feedback. You know, it's not just like the biggest person in the room shouts out. It's like, well, look, I want to leave you with this, and then, you know, we'll do a listening session in a week's time where we take your feedback, or, you know, we'll you know. So really, it's about guiding executives to get the best out of them. And because designers are great facilitators, I think we can be really good at that. But I think we forget all too often. We give great client, you know, we give great stakeholder, lower level stakeholder or user presentations, but we under prepare when we're working with executives.
Okay, we are running out of time, but we've got one last question. So most of the time being a leader comes with the respective lead title. Do you have any advice for someone who tries to support a team as a leader, but currently does not have the title?
Wow, interesting question. I mean, I think there's a couple of things there which I'd really try and sort of delve into. So first of all, job titles are challenging. And actually, in my experience in the UK and in North America, the lead title is actually a bit more of a junior title. So generally what you have is the most senior person in the organization that is a designer might be a chief design officer, or more likely a VP of design. Below them, you'll have a director of design. You'll then maybe below them have a head of design. Below them, you'll have a design manager. And below them, you'll have lead designer or design lead. And typically in my experience, somebody with a title of design lead is usually still a practitioner. They're still doing 2 or 3 or 4 days worth of design a week. They might be sort of mentoring or coaching a smaller team of 3 or 4 people. But they generally don't have like management experience. They're leaders in a cultural sense, but they're not managers. So first of all, I think it's useful to kind of get your titles correct. I think if you're in an organization that doesn't understand job titles and roles, that to me indicates the fact that you don't have a progression framework for design in your organization. I suspect somewhere, particularly if you're in a large organization, you have some kind of leveling system which says you're a level 1 engineer, you're a level 2 engineer, you're a level 3 engineer, etc., etc. If you don't have that for design, you need to create one. If you do have that for design, rather than just be a level 1 designer, level 2 designer, level 3 designer, you need to put in the titles in that progression framework. And below the titles, you need to explain the core activities. And you need to say, well, like at our company, if you exhibit these qualities, you are a design leader or a lead designer. If you exhibit these qualities, you are a head of design or a design director, or on the other end, a senior practitioner. And then once you have a framework to have these conversations, then you go to your boss and you say, well, actually, look, for the last 6 months, I've been, I'm called a principal designer, but I've been fulfilling these functions, and I can evidence that I've done this, this, and this. And in our framework, that would qualify me for a lead title and a pay bump of 10K. And then you have that conversation. So you need the governance structure in place. And if you don't have the governance structure in place, you should put it in place. And to be honest, if you're a person running a design team, I don't know how many people you've got, 5 or 10 people, you're probably working in an organization that has maybe 50 or 100 engineers. And so borrow what they've got and write it for yourself. Hack this from a governance level rather than making kind of a call to power argument. The other thing I think is important to say is you can be a leader without having a title. That's why, I kind of talk about kind of like our conference is leading design. It's not managing design. There are many people who are the go-to people in their organization to help the staff solve problems, but they might not have the title design manager or design leader. So I think it's important to kind of differentiate the characteristics and qualities of leadership versus the role. I think if you've spent, if you put a really, really good case together based on a progression framework you have, and by the way, Clearleft have got a really great progression framework. There's a product called Progression App. If you go to Progression App, you do a search for Progression App, Clearleft Progression Framework, you'll probably find it. You can use that, you can adopt it, you can use it for your own usages. If using those kind of tools, you still can't convince your bosses to give you the title you need. And one of the things to remember is giving someone a title is actually easier than giving a pay rise, and actually you can use that to your advantage. You can go to your boss and say, look, actually, I believe I've been here for 5 years or whatever. I haven't had a pay rise. I'm doing all of these things, which, I wasn't doing before. I believe that I should get 10K pay rise. And if they come back to you and say, well, no, like we don't have the budget, coronavirus, et cetera, then you say, well, okay, how about you give me a title increase and a 2K pay rise? And that negotiating strategy, you're getting something of value to you, but actually has no monetary value to the people involved. And so they're much more likely to do that. And at the end of the day, if you're still in a situation where your company doesn't value your leadership experience, consider going somewhere else that will. If you've been in a company for 3 or 4 years, start looking for the role that has the title and has the skills that that you have. And actually, quite honestly, if you start looking for work, you find a job and you go to your boss and you say, hey, look, the reason I'm moving on is because I like working here, but I'm not being treated with the title that I expect. So I've accepted a job elsewhere. They will almost certainly start a negotiation with you because they realize that if you leave, you're going to leave them in a real difficult situation. And you can leverage that to also have a conversation around titles and pay and salary. So that would be my advice.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Andy. I would like to close our keynote session for today. What an inspiring talk and the great insights you gave us, also for the questions we had. It was a pleasure having you here in our conference. Thank you Normally, I would present you a little present at the moment when you were in Magdeburg, but I can't do it online. So I give you warm wishes from us. Thanks a lot for your inspiring talk. And I hope we see each other someday at the Leading Design Conference, for example. And we will be back there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.